first off, I'd like to introduce Michael Weir. Is it Weir or Ware?
I've been corrected in the UK, so for this interview I'll go with Weir.
Michael Weir. For this time only, Michael
That's
Weir.
right. That's right.
So Michael, he worked for Barack Obama in his White House for faith-based initiatives, particularly leading on outreach with evangelicals during his first term, and then he led faith outreach during the 2012 election campaign as well. He's now chief strategist with the AND campaign, which works to encourage Christians to greater civic engagement and social action. So thanks for joining us, Michael. Next on our panel, we have Andrea Hatcher. Andrea is a professor of politics at the University of the South in Tennessee, and she specializes in American government and politics. She's also the author of Political and Religious Identities of British Evangelicals, which is a book exploring the differences between American and British evangelicals in the political sphere, which I recommend you get a copy of if you're piqued by the interest by this discussion today. So thanks for joining us, Andrea. We also have Mark Woods. Mark's a Baptist minister, and he's a journalist, and he's formerly the editor of Christian Today, which is one of the leading evangelical news sites here in the UK. Not to be confused, of course, with Christianity Today on the other side of the pond. And finally, we have Andy Flannagan, who's currently an empty chair, I think is attending to his son. But Andy is the executive director of Christians in Politics, which is a cross-party organization here in the UK, which tries to encourage Christians to get involved in public life. And he was previously director of Christians on the Left, which is a kind of pressure group of Christians affiliated with the Labour Party. Did I get that all right? Anyone want to correct any of that introduction before we kick off? Brilliant. Okay. Right. So the topic for today's discussion, we wanted to explore how evangelicals in the States are mobilizing and are being engaged ahead of the 2020 presidential election, and then compare that and contrast that with how British evangelicals get involved in politics. I think to kick off the discussion, it's a very famous stat you probably all heard of before, but in 2016, surveys suggested that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump compared to 16% for Hillary Clinton, which is actually higher than the percentage who voted for Bush, McCain, and Romney in the 3 previous elections. So there's been significant discussion, I'm sure everyone's followed it, around the fidelity and the strength of support among evangelicals for Donald Trump. I wanted to begin by asking our American panelists, are you seeing US evangelicals sticking with Trump in equivalently high numbers this time round? And if not, what do you think might have changed? I'll start with you, Michael.
Yeah, so your word choice there is really important. Donald Trump is going to win the white evangelical vote. And it's important, evangelicals are very much divided by race. And so when we talk about the 81%, as you noted, we're talking about white evangelicals. And so to stick with them for a moment, they're going to go for Trump heavily. You correctly noted that the nominee in 2016 performed in some ways at an unfathomably poor way with white evangelicals. 16% is really bad. If I had to prognosticate at this point, I believe Joe Biden's on track for Barack Obama's 2012 numbers. So I'd expect him to be at 20, 21, maybe even 23% among white evangelicals. And it's important for folks to note, so white evangelicals typically account for about a quarter of the electorate, although demographers and folks who watch this stuff closely, like I do, expect for that to change, if not in this presidential election in 2024. White evangelicals are vastly overrepresented in the American electorate. Depending on what survey you use, they account for about 17% of the overall population, and yet they're at 26, 27% of the electorate. And so just a few percentage points of a swing is 1 million, 2 million, 3 million votes. And to the extent that that swing is concentrated in states that are particularly important, I would look to see Joe Biden overperforming among white evangelicals in the Rust Belt in particular, and that could have a very significant impact in this election. The last thing I'd say is, I noted sort of the racial difference, and maybe we'll get into that. Black Protestants, some of whom identify as evangelicals, others don't, are going to be significantly behind Joe Biden. The Trump campaign has been making an effort, particularly to go after Black men, and we'll see if that has an effect. A real key voting bloc in this election are Hispanic Protestants, Hispanic evangelicals, particularly as Joe Biden looks to pick off a state like Arizona or Florida. It's going to be really important to see how the Hispanic evangelical vote shakes out, and that's definitely one to watch.
Have you seen, you or Andrew can come into this one, I guess, have you seen a significant change in how evangelicals of any race are attracted or put off by the Republican Party and their nominee over the last 4 years since the previous election? Has the kind of facts on the ground changed after they kind of helped put Donald Trump in the White House?
I would say,
yeah, please.
No, I would just say that if anything, I think that white evangelicals have solidified behind their nominee. So Trump may not have been their choice in the primary, and political science research bears that out. At the beginning of the Republican primary, they wouldn't have chosen him. They would have preferred a Ted Cruz or a Rubio or a Santorum even. But once they chose Donald Trump, once he became the Republican nominee, they have gone full force behind him. And that's because of the perhaps we can say unholy alliance between the white evangelicals and the Republican Party. And so much of what is driving their support for Donald Trump now is that he is the Republican nominee. He's the Republican. And so there is a body of research examining why evangelicals supported Trump so strongly in 2016, when there's so many factors about his personal life that would suggest otherwise. And so much of the driving force was, in fact, negative partisanship, their dislike, utter dislike for Hillary Clinton, for example, to a lesser degree in 2012, their dislike for Obama. But negative partisanship was really at work in 2016. And so since then, I think that they've just been very much committed to the man that they've chosen to lead their party.
And does the choice of Biden as a Democrat nominee undo some of that negative partisanship? Is he a more appealing character to evangelicals than Clinton was?
So, yeah, not because, so a few things. One, Joe Biden is someone who as a person, it's been very difficult for the Republican Party and for Trump to characterize him as an extreme leftist. Even at their convention, you could see them using phrases like Donald Trump and the extreme left of his party, or Donald Trump is a puppet of the extreme left. The concession there is they don't think they could sell that Joe Biden himself is sort of an extreme anti-religion, a leftist or whatever rhetoric they might concoct. And the other thing I'd say is that, and I've made this argument before, in 2016, the Clinton campaign committed really profound political malpractice by virtually ignoring broad swaths of religious voters. The Biden campaign has not been making that mistake. Yeah. A clear invitation to religious voters, including evangelicals, has been extended, and that counts for something. There's a message that has been sent that the Biden campaign will not just sort of take evangelical votes if they're sufficiently repelled by Trump, but that the Biden campaign is inviting evangelicals to support them. And again, I expect to see that show up in the polls. Again, not huge gains, but some percentage point pickups, where it matters, for sure.
Can I just add there, following up, that I know this is a panel about evangelicals, but as long as we're talking about the potential for Biden to pick up religious votes, I think where you're going to see movement is among the white Catholic vote. Because in 2016, Trump had a 23% lead in that group over Hillary Clinton. Right now, in the latest poll that came out, Trump's approval rating among white Catholics his lead over Biden was just 5%. So I think to the extent that you see any movement in the religious vote, it's going to be among Catholics, particularly white Catholics, perhaps Hispanic Catholics as well. But I wouldn't expect much more beyond white evangelicals going to Biden, more than leveling off to perhaps Obama numbers. As I think Michael quoted earlier, the latest approval rating for Biden among white evangelicals was 22%. So again, if there's a difference to be made in the religious vote, I think it's going to come from the Catholics, white Catholics.
What are the key issues that could sway evangelical voters either way? Are they still some of the ones that, here in the UK, we're often told it's about these hot button issues about guns and abortion? Is that a bit crude? Is that a bit of a stereotype, or are those the ones that are still going to be swaying people's votes?
Well, there is a distinction to be made between what is sort of given as a reason for their support and what actually sort of lies under the surface. I mean, just in my experience, the biggest reason for supporting Trump is very much in line with what Andrea laid out, which is that there is a culture of republicanism and culture of conservative politics in evangelical, particularly white evangelical churches. And so the increasing identification with partisan identity, the increasing identification with a set of sort of cultural practices, forums, values, has been sort of transmuted onto Trump, even if it's an ill fit in some ways. And then the unfortunate thing that we're learning is that in other ways, for American evangelicals, it's a better fit than many might hope, than I would hope, given this president's propensity for xenophobic, racist comments, this president's tendency to play loose with the facts, to say the least, this president's now willingness to throw any sense of commitment to the will of the people into a point of question by, just over 5 weeks out from the election, suggesting that that the election results can't be trusted and that he may not accept them. And so, there are a lot of issues driving. One thing that's interesting that we need to wait to see is now with the Supreme Court in play. What it does do is it helps Trump articulate a case that he can't articulate himself. It has the potential of cementing white evangelical allegiance to Trump because it focuses the debate in a way that Trump just simply isn't disciplined enough to focus it. We have to see how this plays out. I do think the Biden campaign so far has not been succumbing to sort of the temptations of a moment like this. Instead of Biden has been calling to lower the temperature. He's been focusing particularly on the effects another Trump nominee might have to the ACA, our healthcare, not to hot button issues, but the temptations are going to be ever present, especially when we get to the debates, for Biden to be forced to position himself as sort of the last hope of a progressive policy agenda. That's not how he won the Democratic primary. It's not how he's framed this election so far. And his campaign needs to be careful about breaking up the coalition that they've built over the last year and a half, 2 years, in order to chase, this obviously unexpected and very central, important issue of who fills this Supreme Court seat.
It's fascinating as well, because I recall reading lots of things from kind of prominent evangelical church leaders back in 2016 who said that the issue of appointing conservative judges, and in particular Supreme Court justices, was the one that had swayed their mind. And, they expressed some unease around candidate Trump and his, particularly on questions around character, integrity, and morality. But they said, we just can't give Hillary Clinton the keys to the Supreme Court. As Christians, it's too important to us. Andrew, do you agree? Do you think the Supreme Court vacancy is going to completely electrify and energize this issue like it wasn't before?
I tend to think so, absolutely. And back to your earlier point, I hate to play to stereotypes, but your question, does the issue come down to abortion? And I'm afraid it does. And I grant the nuance and the very thorough analysis that Michael just gave, but to a large degree, perception is reality. And to the extent that evangelicals perceive that abortion is the most important issues, they act as if abortion is the most important issue for them. And just as a point of anecdata, tonight, my mother's evangelical church in the swing state of Florida is holding a prayer meeting to pray for, as it was explained on the phone messaging tree that went around to members last night, to pray for President Trump because, quote, the Democrats have gone crazy. And for an evangelical televangelist to get on the platform every week and to say, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but you can't vote for a baby killer. Literal language that is going out over the airwaves and reaching evangelicals. So abortion is still the galvanizing frame for evangelicals. And they have excused it now in the era of Trump to this transactional relationship that we may not like the man who is Donald Trump. We may not agree with his personal life. But to the extent that he will give us judges who will overturn Roe v. Wade and end, as they put it, the scourge of abortion in this land, that's what we must do, that there indeed is a moral mandate to act to do that. So I do think abortion is, if there is the single issue, it is the single galvanizing issue for evangelicals. I see no evidence to the contrary. And I think that this vacant Supreme Court seat will just mobilize them all the more.
Yeah, if I can make a few comments. In 2016, in one of the presidential debates, and I've heard this from leaders, and I thought it while watching it, Hillary Clinton was asked a question about late-term abortion, and any Democratic nominee for the last 20 years would have answered that question by, like her husband did, calling for abortion to be safe, legal, and rare, would have talked about what a complex moral sort of decision this is, and that no one takes it lightly. And instead, Hillary Clinton launched into a 90-second, 2-minute defense of late-term abortion and why it's necessary. That's how it was heard by many Americans generally, not just to mention evangelicals. There's going to be a moment in these debates coming up where Biden will be able to either answer in line with his personal history on this issue, which is one of expressing great moral nuance, even sort of acknowledging his personal discomfort with abortion, as he expressed in his 2007 book. He's called himself a middle of the road person who's taken shots from both sides on this issue. If he answers in that way, I think he's going to be in a pretty strong position. If he answers in the way some of activist groups in DC and New York want him to, then it could lead to a very similar situation. And that's a moment to watch for. It's going to be a critical piece of how this plays out, and whether the voters that Andrea is talking about feel get that extra bit of motivation from Biden handing Trump something that he could use in a debate like that. The other thing I'd say is, I just know, and it's difficult for the Democrats themselves to make this case, because it would undermine their argument that Trump is going to put on these sort of reliably conservative justices. But Justice Kavanaugh, who Trump appointed, was part of the decision to not even take up an important abortion rights case that conservatives wanted the Supreme Court to take up, saw it as an important opportunity for this new conservative majority to limit abortion rights, and Kavanaugh was a part of not allowing them to do so. Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote the opinion reading sexual orientation into the Civil Rights Act, into Title VII, which was the major, if there was any major fear on religious freedom from conservatives, it was don't let Hillary Clinton get in because she'll appoint people who will just read sexual orientation into Title VII. And so I do think there's some work to be done that maybe a real estate mogul and reality TV star doesn't exactly have the constitutional and legal bona fides to be entrusted with this responsibility of protecting religious freedom and prosecuting a very difficult, very complex sort of moves on abortion. And so someone should be making that case over the next 5.5 weeks and undermining folks' confidence, social conservatives' confidence in Trump's ability to appoint nominees that can be trusted.
That's really interesting. I'm going to turn to Andy, actually. I wanted to ask, you've been hearing a lot from Andrew and Michael over the last couple of minutes about what is motivating evangelicals. How different, how much does that chime with your experience of evangelicals on this side of the Atlantic? How different are they from their kind of American counterparts?
Thanks very much, Tim. Hi, folks. How are you? I may have regular appearances from Jesse and Jubilee next door, so apologies for that. But great, lovely to see you all. I think the one thing that I just was wanting to throw into the last discussion was that there might be a real difference, actually, if it happens, if the Supreme Justice is appointed in the next 5 weeks, and that happens, if the deal is done pre-election, it actually removes some of the sense of then voting to ensure that when the 6-3 majority is already there. So I think that's something interesting to watch as we go ahead, that actually some of the internal logic of voting that way may be decreased slightly if the deal is already done. And if you think, all right, we've got the 6-3 majority in the pocket now, so actually we can now in safety vote in another way come the election. That's
a really good point, actually. And I guess there's a kind of delicate political balance for Mitch McConnell in the Senate to know when to schedule any hearings if presumably Trump does go ahead and name a nominee, whether it's before or after the election, what kind of gives them the most political juice, as it were. Yeah. But when you consider from your kind of side here in Britain, how different does it feel examining the kind of state of play of politics among evangelicals compared to what Michael and Andrea are talking about and the issues that mobilize them? Our questions around abortion and let alone places on our highest judicial offices, are they relevant for evangelicals in this country?
I think for years and years and years in forums like this, we have often discussed the major differences between UK and US evangelicals and how those differences often stem from a difference in theology and a difference in missiology and in the way that those things play out and in the priorities, not just in the priorities of the UK Evangelical Church, but also in the actual strategy of the UK Evangelical Church, because you're talking a group of folks with much lower numbers compared to the United States. So a strategy that might work across the pond, even if you thought that was a good strategy, may not actually be a useful strategy when you have many less numbers in the UK. So I think what we are, so there is a huge difference, and I'm not sure the folks on this call need many of those differences elicited. I'm going to show a clip in a moment that sort of describes a little bit about the difference in strategy and methodology and reasoning in terms of our approach, and certainly what's happening with the folks who are involved in the Christian groupings within all the full spread of the political parties. It's a very more relational approach. It's a persuasive approach. It's an integrationist approach as opposed to a power games approach. And I think it's really important to point out, though, and not be naive, that actually the influence of social media seeping across the pond, and our sort of most of the UK's pleasant obsession with Barack Obama, and then our kind of more negative obsession with Donald Trump, means that there is more and more of the American influence and the tribalization and that polarization seeping into our culture here. And then we could talk about Brexit, and we could talk about the last election, and how that polarization and that the silo effect of social media, that is having an impact, and we're naive to think that it's not having an impact actually over here in the UK. So we're, as Christians in politics, we're fighting very hard to make sure we keep the conversation open, that actually folks are continuing to build relationship one with another. The key part of our strategy is to get people together from across the political spectrum, from across the denominational spectrum, to get people together. Because you could try and disagree well by doing this stuff, by being more polite on social media, but actually the only way, the silver bullet of disagreeing well and holding a society together, is building relationship with those who are not like us, who are different to us. And that's what we're trying to do with Christians in Politics, local groups all across the UK, where people are coming together from across the spread of churches and from across the spread of political persuasions, to come together, to listen to one another, sometimes to even pray together, but actually to build those relationships that can vouchsafe and hold the society together. So I just wanted to show you a little video which explains a little bit more about that.
Making noise helps us feel better, but it may not be so great for the rest of the world. Noise makes you move away from something. Relationship draws you closer to someone. Do we just want to feel like we've done our duty, or do we want to have real influence? If so, we need to do the hard yards of relationship building. It may not be fast and it may not be pretty, but we will learn and be transformed in the process. And it may just lead to moments when impossible and beautiful things cause everyone to stop and stare and say, "The Lord, He is God."
Thanks, Andy. Does that chime with you in your experience, Mark? Do you think British evangelicals do adopt this kind of consensual relationship, less kind of hot button approach that Andy's been sketching out there? Is that true in your experience?
Yeah, I thought that was spot on, actually, and I thought it was a brilliant video as well. In my experience of the evangelicals in this country, they are less confrontational. They tend to work with the grain of society. They are more inclined to talk, and they're kind of embedded in the culture. I mean, one of the reasons for this is that many evangelicals, of course, belong to the Church of England, and the Church of England is so much embedded in the culture as well, just by virtue of being a state church. And they have to talk to the people who are in power. They have to be sort of, they're part of the operation of the state, as it were. And I think that is something as well. So I mean, from everything I've seen, we are different over here. But that's a personal impression. Andrea literally wrote the book on this, so
it's true.
So I'd be interested in hearing what she has to say, actually.
Yeah, well, let's come to Andrew then, who did literally write the book on this. Did you find that evangelicals in Britain and America had noticeably different political traditions?
Absolutely. And thank you for that wonderful setup, which I've just been dying to jump in here. So there are some extraordinarily key differences between the two. First of all, British evangelicals are not partisan or ideological. In the survey and the focus groups that I did in evangelical congregations all over the country, as well as interviews with religious political elites, they were just as likely to identify as Labour, as conservative, as Lib Dem, as whatever. So that relationship with conservative politics, the Republican Party that we see in American evangelicals, there is no parallel partisanship among British evangelicals. And more to the point that both Andy and Mark were raising, British evangelicals very much do not want to be seen as an out-group. They want to be seen as part of the cultural mainstream. And I really liked Mark's explanation of that in fact, so many evangelicals are part of the Anglican Church. And perhaps that is a very good reason for why they, in fact, are part of the cultural mainstream. They really do fear being mocked. As long as we're here appearing before the Religion Media Center, they fear being mocked in the popular press, and they will do many things to pull their punches, as it were, and not challenge some things or go along, not continually to fight battles that American evangelicals like fighting. In my writings, I think that American evangelicals relish the role of being a peculiar people, as Second Peter calls it, whereas British evangelicals, they really like to be part of the mainstream. And so I think that's key to understanding their behavior. They don't fight the culture war. So in my survey, one of the questions I asked, what is the most important problem facing this nation today? You can imagine asking that question among American evangelicals, and the culture war issues that we've already addressed here would be front and center. There was no mention of abortion, of same-sex marriage. British evangelicals feel that those issues have already been fought there. The law is settled, and they have no wish to readdress those matters. That is not a galvanizing and mobilizing platform for them. The issues that they do care about are social justice issues of food banks and hunger and poverty and human trafficking. And circling back around to that wonderful video clip that Andy showed, their approach to politics, they are not unengaged from politics. They are very much interested in politics and civic life, but they do so on this relationship approach that Andy's video described, where they connect with various civic groups, oftentimes secular groups, on this sort of single issue push to address problems that I mentioned before of human trafficking, hunger, etc. So those are just some key differences across the pond.
That's really helpful. Mark, sorry, did you want to come in on that?
Well, just to say that I think, I mean, obviously Andrea is completely right there. But just to say as well, since we're talking to journalists, there are some evangelical organizations which are very happy to act as Elijahs and very happy to be countercultural and to make a lot of noise on social media and, you know, to issue various incendiary press releases and fight battles that other evangelicals might not. And because they are good at PR, it gives them the impression of being more influential than they are actually. And I think that's just something that that journalists just need to watch out for. You know, there are people who, you know, might claim to speak for evangelicals, but if you actually dig down, you do the research, they don't actually speak for evangelicals, not in a broad sense at all. I mean, I think the other thing to illustrate what Andrea was saying actually was an open letter which came out just at the end of last week from a few evangelical ministers taking the government to task for its the restrictions that it's placed on social gatherings, including church worship because of the coronavirus crisis, and warning that these limitations on Christian worship should not be reimposed or extended. But the interesting thing was how they pitched their open letter to the government. And it was not, we demand the right to meet as Christians, and you are infringing on our personal liberties, and this is an attack on churches and all that sort of thing. One of the key sentences there is the supportive relationship that churches nurture between people are vital and simply cannot be dispensed with again without significant harm. In other words, their point of departure is the social damage that it would do, as they say, by closing churches, rather than the right of Christians to worship. So they're coming from a completely different point of view.
I just wanted to come back to Michael here, actually, because I think, is it fair to say, Michael, that even back across on your side of the Atlantic, we often have a kind of slightly simplistic understanding of evangelicals? You mentioned before about how race makes a huge difference. But also, I mean, these surveys are often about self-described evangelicals, and no one in the UK ever claims the term if they're not actually a Bible-believing, church-going Christian, whereas in the States, it could encompass a whole bunch of nominals. I saw one survey that said something like a third of self-described evangelicals disagreed with the statement that Jesus was God.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, no, so I think that's true. There is a legacy of a cultural cachet, particularly in parts of the South, with being an evangelical, that in the UK you just don't have. And so I do think this is fading out. I do think that we're seeing part of the reason for the decline, which hasn't been too drastic, but you look at the numbers and, it's significant, is just the social capital isn't there. And in some places, in some regions of the country, and in some sort of sectors, there's actually a sort of a negative effect on social capital of identifying as an evangelical. And so I think that's key. The other thing I'd say is it is, and Andrea sort of hinted at this before, it's really important not to overestimate the extent to which religion is in the driver's seat when you're talking about evangelical politics. We are, I've said before, the problem really isn't that Christians in America are making such an exceptionally bad contribution to our politics. The problem is that there's really not anything exceptional about Christian politics at all, particularly when you're talking about sort of the ways in which evangelicals in particular engage. They're as driven by effective polarization as everybody else, if not more so. Their inability to transcend partisan boundaries is reflective of the political culture in the States, not a break from it. And so religion matters. These voters do identify as religious, and so it's important to invite them as religious people, to engage them as religious people. But I just wouldn't, I wouldn't overestimate or sort of pretend like everything evangelicals do, and this applies to other religious groups in America, everything these groups do in civic life has some sort of theological root that if you just dig down far enough, you'll find a lot of it is just cultural stuff that sometimes presents as religious, but really can't be found in scripture, unfortunately.
Andy, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I just want to say I think I couldn't agree more with Michael. But Michael, the humble man that he is, hasn't yet mentioned actually some of the stuff that he's actually involved in over there, which I think is a really important conversation as well, especially since we're talking about evangelicals, because it's also reflected here that actually with Michael's "and" campaign in the States and those over here who talk about having a both and attitude, that actually rejecting the kind of, in some ways, the really simplistic post-Enlightenment model of left and right, that actually there are many evangelicals and there are many Christians who would say, well, on economic issues, I'm kind of, slightly to the left of the center, but on social issues, I'm maybe soft right, I'm slightly more over here. And actually, that's probably the way most people operate, if they're honest. But because of the tribalization and the polarization, especially in the toxicity of social media, people have to retreat to the safety of their tribe, their largely progressive or largely conservative tribe, when actually the reality, when you talk to people in the church in the UK, actually, I would say the center of gravity is largely left of center economically, but soft right on social issues. And so raising a flag, as Michael is doing with the "and" campaign in the States, is really important for keeping that conversation and keeping that nuance and keeping that perspective that's not just, and it allows people to not be just captured as a whole group of people have been by one side in the States. And it's rising up. That flag is rising in Britain as well, for folks who are saying, look, hey, it's not just as simple as left and right. And actually, as the theologian Tom Wright says, he puts it brilliantly. He says, it strikes me that in life, as in parenting, there are moments where a progressive response is required, i.e. things need to change. When Jesse, when he became 6 last year and he started reading a lot, we read, he needs to go to bed later. Something had to change. But there are also moments in life, as in parenting, when a conservative response is required. i.e., no, Jesse, we still don't pour water on the laptop just because you're older. Things need to stay the same. There are moments when a conservative response is required. And our problem in our present era is that instead of stopping, reflecting, even being prayerful, even consulting ancient wisdom with every issue that comes along, we instead respond quickly, immediately, with the knee-jerk response of our tribe, rather than allowing that debate and allowing that discussion. And so I just want to honor what Michael's up to doing that. And there are various folks and various people involved in trying to make that happen here too.
Great. I'm going to take this opportunity to bring in some questions from some of the journalists who've been watching and patiently listening along. Have we got anyone who'd like to chip in and ask a question of our panel? Harry.
Yeah, it was just picking up from what Michael was saying, just the last point that you were making, really, and in terms of thinking about journalists framing the issues in this election, I guess, and just what you were saying about the importance between making the distinction between white evangelicals and black or Hispanic evangelicals. I mean, do you think that it's not really about religion then? Is it much more about race and culture than it is about faith? And really, is it a mistake to be talking about evangelicals at all in that sense? And I suppose that's a question both to you and to Andrea, I guess. Do we make too much of religion in American politics, and it's actually much more to do with race and cultural issues?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think that there's actually, at least in the American context, an unfortunate sort of downplaying and illiteracy when it comes to religion. But what's important to understand is that religious communities are communities where culture is created, both out of the sort of directly from faith, but where other elements are at play as well, where other concerns are allowed to have priority that can be influenced by faith, can also be influenced by a certain way of looking at culture, a certain way of looking at public life, a certain way of looking at politics. I mean, I think what we've seen, well, let me not go there. To address the race question, in some ways it's simply a matter of what presses in closest to the community. If you're so Pew put out a really interesting study, I think in March or April. A majority, like vast majority of two groups in America believe the Bible should have a great deal or some say in U.S. laws, in policy making, and it's white evangelicals and black Protestants. They did a follow-up question on that, which was if Scripture Scripture contradicts U.S. law, or democratic will, which should take precedent? And majorities, I think they were slim, but slim majorities said the Bible should take precedence. These are two groups that almost at equal levels are in completely opposite parties. Well, what's happening? The two groups who agree on the question that the Bible should significantly influence American law, how do you bridge that gap? Well, black evangelicals and Protestants are largely, thinking of the fact that there's a Republican Party now that is directly, intentionally seeking to limit their right to vote. That is giving sort of space for racial injustice in this country and sort of downplaying racial injustice. And unless a Republican Party, which by the way, they aim to do, at least significant figures in the Republican Party, the autopsy of the 2012 loss was, we need to become a more diverse party. We need to listen to other people's concerns that aren't right now members of the Republican Party. Of course, Trump sort of turned all of that back. And so Harry, it's just not a simple story. It's not right to shove people's faith off to the side. The best thing we can do is try to get an integration of how people's faith is influencing their politics, but also the ways in which the systems and cultures they're a part of influence the way that they think their faith ought to apply. There's much more to say, but I would wonder if Andrea has thoughts on that.
Oh, could we unmute Andrew? There we go.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Right away, I'm thinking of this stream of research that came out after 2016, examining the religious vote for Donald Trump. And a couple of sociologists focused on this concept of Christian nationalism. And they found that that really was driving the vote for Donald Trump, that religion at once was mediated by and reinforced feelings of Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalism, it was an index variable, many questions surrounding a set of beliefs and ideals that, as they put it, seek the national preservation of this Christian identity, national Christian identity. And so they found that even controlling for other variables such as economic anxiety, Islamophobia, racism, sexism, etc., that levels of Christian nationalism were most correlated with a vote for Donald Trump. And then when they looked at religion's relationship with that, they found that looking at both indicators of belief as well as practice, how often do you go to church, how often do you pray, etc., that those were mediated by Christian feelings of Christian nationalism. So just to add some data to the point Michael was making earlier, there is this underlying cultural thing that religion seems to connect with, and sometimes is mediated by this, such as Christian nationalism. At other times, religion seems to enforce or exacerbate that, perhaps along some issues of gender roles and race. For example, we know that the roots of the Christian right in America came about from disputes over segregation and integration. So there is this tight intersection between religious self-identification, beliefs, practices that connect to other important variables.
Let me just very quickly add, you know, a key thing is whether Democrats wave away all of these concerns and sort of sweep religious conservatives under the rug of whatever label you want to use, whether it's Christian nationalism or any of these others, just frankly, just calling them bigots, or whether Democrats are willing to make an earnest attempt to speak to the positive values that they see in what evangelicals are advancing, and whether Democrats are willing to not sort of simply use evangelicals as a foil to promote stronger allegiance among their base. In other words, doing exactly what Republicans do, which is say, you know, look at those, we can't let those extremists take power. That can motivate your own voters. The problem is that it actually reinforces the very feelings of embattlement that Donald Trump and Republicans capitalize on. And so the real challenge here is, how do you affirm what is good and how do you reject what is bad? I'm someone who thinks the Christian faith offers a lot of resources for that, and as Andy noted, that's a lot of what we try and do with the AMP campaign.
I just wanted to move on to another question we've had here in the chat. It was before we ran out of time, from Andrew, saying surveys here, actually in the UK, show that Christian immigrants are very socially conservative. And so to what extent is it the racism of the right that keeps them glued to the parties of the left? And if that was not there, would they still vote for parties that are more socially liberal? Anyone want to come in on that in particular?
I just say it's a good question. It's a hypothetical that, like I said, in 2012 seemed like a very live question. And I do think we saw, you know, the Muslim vote in this country prior to 2001, prior to 9/11, was a Republican vote. When you look at George W. Bush's successes among, for instance, Hispanic evangelicals, that was a real thing. And so, I do think that if you had a more open Republican Party, it would put real pressure on Democrats in a way that I think would be healthy for the country. The question is just whether there's the internal motivation, whether the Republican Party can figure out how to motivate aspects of its base while reaching out beyond it. And it doesn't seem like they've been able to or have wanted to figure that out, particularly during the Trump years.
In the UK context, does any of Andy or Mark, do you have any thoughts on that issue about whether Christians, particularly those immigrants, might drift away to kind of reshape the political sphere on that one?
I think we haven't got the huge numbers to get very meaningful data on that, but there's certainly some evidence of a fade in that direction. That's not too surprising, but there are huge cultural things pulled up in that in terms of talking about those who are involved in what you call the immigrant churches in the UK. I think the thing to note, probably the biggest, most important thing to note, especially in this season, we must not speak outside the meaning very, very huge context of COVID, and we are naive if we do not recognize, and I suspect most of us in our news feeds and in our social media feeds have noticed that actually there has been a turning of people because of the time people have had at home on social media, because of the fear factor of COVID, and because of the kind of conspiracy theory stuff that has kicked off so strongly. There has been a filter of that from the States over to the UK, and there has been a freedom to post more radical things from some folks in the evangelical community in the UK that has to be noted, and has been a very definite thing during the course. And there are, we could sit and analyze all day why COVID has particularly been an incubator for that, but it's definitely been notable. So that cultural read across, I think that's something to look at and note and see if it continues.
Just got time for one last question. There's a really interesting one in the chat here from Chris, actually. It's about the question of a kind of ecumenical alliance between Catholics and evangelicals who have joined forces in support of Trump and some other issues. Do any of our guests think that we're seeing the growth of a kind of theoconservative or theocratic voting bloc between those two groups previously in previous generations, maybe quite at odds with each other?
That's the Christian right. Yeah, that's the basis of the Christian right. And that's one reason why abortion became such a salient issue and is now, because it was used as the issue to bring together conservative evangelicals with Catholics that, as you note, historically had been at great odds. So yeah, that coalition is there. That is the Christian coalition from the 90s in the US. That is the basis of the Christian right movement here. In my research, I see no indication that a similar sort of coalition is forming or has the ingredients to form in the UK.
Well, what's interesting is that just real quickly, Andy. What's interesting is that Trump has put pressure on the elite side of this in really interesting ways. We saw Archbishop Gregory of the DC area. The Trump administration called him disgraceful after Archbishop Gregory spoke out against an action the Trump administration took. We've seen major evangelical leaders like Max Lucado and Beth Moore, Tim Keller to a certain extent, have incisive things to say about the Trump administration. Part of what this era has exposed is a crisis of authority in American Christianity broadly, a disconnect between laity and clergy that has profound political implications. And so that's something that Trump has intentionally gone after. It. When you look at who Trump surrounds himself with, it's not institutional religious leaders. It's people with their own brands, that don't have boards, that have their own individual platforms. They aren't accountable to really anybody. These are like personal forces of nature, and he loves that. He loves the ability to get to religious people without dealing with all the bureaucracy. And it's going to be interesting to see how religious institutions deal with this sort of this kind of political encroachment on their authority.
Just one last thought from Andy before we have to wrap
I would say a lot of the practical learning from this story that we're telling is for the left in the UK. I think the huge challenge to the Labour Party in the UK is it going to continue to be a broad church of folks who are representing working people and therefore has a spread of opinion on social issues? Or will it allow itself to become the Democrats, where it's a more narrow ideological progressive thing where it will only really attract folks from the cosmopolitan centres in the same way that you've got that split happening in America? That's the huge challenge. That's the huge challenge of all this data and all this storytelling is will the left in the UK hear that and find a vocabulary and find an embrace that can actually mobilise a lot of people who are very for it, but desperately do not want them to slide in the same direction as the Democrats in the States.
Thanks so much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. It's been really a fascinating discussion. I'd love to carry on talking, but we've hit 5 o'clock, so I must draw things to a close. I also want to thank again Andrea, Michael, Andy and Mark for joining us and for sharing their expertise and their insight and their thoughts. Please do look them up on social media and read Andrea's book and support them in any way you can. They're great people. And thanks so much for joining and following along and for asking such interesting questions. We appreciate you sharing this time with us. Do keep close to the Religion Media Centre website. We've got many more of these panels coming up in the next few weeks, including some others that are going to be tackling other aspects of religion and politics. But yeah, other than that, I'll just say thanks everyone for joining in. I hope you have a great afternoon or morning in the States, and I hope you see you again soon. Cheerio.